Let's welcome to the show Melanie Nelson. Melanie is a licensed Māori translator and a spokesperson for the signatories to the open letter that was sent to the government saying, warning, warning, what ACT is saying is not accurate. It's my paraphrase, Melanie. I hope that's an okay paraphrase, but welcome to the show.
Kia ora. Thanks for inviting me on.
Rather than paraphrasing stupidly, tell us about the letter, tell us about what it's about and why a group of, what would you say, New Zealand's foremost experts when it comes to translation signed to it to send to the government?
It's 27 licensed translators and is a high standard to reach to be a licensed translator. And many of them are really well known.
Right.
So, yeah, we have sent a letter to the government, to the Prime Minister and several key ministers, because we're so concerned at the inaccuracies contained in the proposed treaty principles for the Treaty Principles Bill. And we had a good look at it from a translator's perspective and can see that the international ethical standards of translation have been seriously breached, a number of those ethical standards in the proposed principles. So we felt it was our responsibility to our profession and to the languages involved and to the principle of truth to write this letter to ensure that the Prime Minister and government are aware of these inaccuracies.
Yeah, also, I'm just going to acknowledge to people, thanks for joining us today because you're at the tail end of COVID. So I assume you're tired and you're recovering. So thank you for giving us some time as well. This is the letter. I just maybe will read the first paragraph so people know sort of where you guys are coming from. It's addressing the Prime Minister and ministers. We are highly concerned that ministers are using deeply flawed translations of Te Reo Māori in the treaty's principle bill. Doing so misrepresents foundational concepts, misinforms public discourse, does violence to a treasured and official language, and will cause serious long-term harm to national unity and confidence in good governance. Effective and responsible political debate and government actions should never be premised on misinformation. We encourage the Prime Minister to insist that all ministers uphold truth and accuracy as the most basic standards of good governance. I've got a bunch of other things highlighted in the letter, but I thought maybe what I'd ask you is, because you're talking about misrepresenting the foundational concepts. This is the bill as we look at it. I'm getting messages on places like Twitter, of course, with people saying things like, but if you read the bill, if you read what they're trying to do, what's wrong with that? And my response to them has been, but that's not an accurate translation. And the response back has been, well, be that the case or not, what's wrong with everyone being equal as ACT is trying to do? So maybe you could address for me and for the people in my incredibly healthy Twitter feed, not toxic at all, the idea of how important it is to have an accurate translation before we even get to, is this a good piece of legislation to implement?
Yeah, kia ora. So what you showed is the proposed treaty principles, which ACT campaigned on, and the ones they're promoting for inclusion in the bill. So we haven't actually seen the bill yet, but we were sufficiently concerned at the inaccuracies in the proposed principles to speak out now. And the issue here is that David Seymour and ACT Party have repeatedly stated that these proposed principles are what the Māori text of Te Tiriti actually says. And so that is the premise for these proposed principles, that they're based on what Te Tiriti actually says. And so that, of course, comes down to looking at the Māori text of Te Tiriti and seeing if that's actually what it says. So what we found when we did that is that the Māori text that you see in those proposed principles you put up, those partial phrases are extracted from the Māori text of Te Tiriti. They're taken out of context, and then that includes linguistic context, and they would have a different meaning, or actually a coherent meaning in that linguistic context, because these partial phrases don't even make sense on their own in Te Reo Māori. So they've been taken out of linguistic context, which gives them meaning, but also cultural and historical context. And so when you're doing translation, it's critically important, and a really core ethical standard is that you translate with regard to the actual and intended meaning of the text, and that you do that with regards to and in the context, all those different contexts that I've outlined. So that's been breached in the English principles that have been reached here, and also by the taking of the Māori phrases out of context. So our statement is that none of these proposed principles are truly present in the Māori text of Te Tiriti, and they're also not present in the English text of the treaty. But they've claimed to be taken from the Māori text, and what's happened is that they've taken a very small number of words, so 35 out of 170 words from the 3 articles of the Māori text of Te Tiriti, and then left things out, obviously, taking just that
Right.
small number of words, added things in, and distorted the meaning. And so we come to this set of principles, which are claim to be what Te Tiriti actually says, and they're not. And so as translators, we can see that, and we're not the first to say that. Many Māori speakers and treaty experts have been saying that. But as translators, we have ethical standards to follow and processes that we follow. And so we've applied those processes. And for example, one is to back translate and find out to see if it actually goes back when you translate it back into Māori, to see that the concepts are still the same. And
like reverse engineering it from what they're saying to see what it would be.
Yeah. So if you translate something from Māori to English, you then back translate it into Māori to review and see if you've retained the very subtleties of meaning, which is so critical. And that's why we're speaking as translators, because around the world, the use of language in translation is key for transparency and integrity. And, you wouldn't want New Zealand to be taking out the key principles of a trade agreement with China that was in Chinese without involving Chinese interpreters and translators. And so that's a really basic standard that, government departments do follow good standards generally for translation, and involve licensed translators and peer review and quality assurance processes that are really strong. And that's for good reason. You need things to say what they were intended to say when they appear in different languages. And it doesn't seem that those processes have been followed here. And so for legislation, it should absolutely be followed. That should be an even stronger process than for normal translations, and especially legislation which seeks to, change, it would change the meaning of over 50 laws, and potentially also our constitutional arrangements. So it's very important and significant piece of legislation, and it needs to have a foundation of absolute truth and rigorous quality control.
Yeah, and that's when David Seymour comes out and goes, we're not touching the treaty. We're not touching the treaty. We're leaving the treaty alone. We're just looking at how you read the treaty. In other words, it's like, well, but that means you're looking at interpreting it a different way, which completely changes the meaning and context of the treaty. So you are touching the treaty. I've done a lot of study of ancient texts. Well, a lot. I'm exaggerating. Some study. And one of the, I think it's called hermeneutics, one of the things we do is we look at the context of the word as to what it meant in the day as well, because it may be different today. I guarantee you, if in 50 years before today or 50 years after today, if you looked for the word fire, then that will mean probably, flames, open flames on a piece of wood. But it gets used in context today by some to mean this is the best option ever. So words change and they grow and they evolve. As a part of unless this is just nefarious, and unless actors just doing something they know is wrong to push through an agenda they want, if they're not doing that, if we're being gracious and just say they're wrong, are they missing a big part of what, for example, kawanatanga or tino rangatira meant of the day, and they're putting a modern context and spin on it as to what they say it means today? Is this a part of it?
A good question. Yeah, so we're absolutely not ascribing intention. And, we've sent this letter in good faith so that they can know that this is not what Te Tiriti says, and that the Prime Minister and senior ministers now know that So if they continue now on with this, then they're doing it intentionally with that knowledge. But we don't know what their process has been to date. So I think, I think you raised some important points around meanings of words. So another really significant and important ethical standard for translation is around cultural sensitivity and understanding the meanings of words within that cultural context. And that is one of the core issues here that we're raising, is that Article 2 of Te Tiriti o Waitangi guaranteed Māori, hapu rangatira, and all Māori people, the New Zealanders as they were called at that time. And so that's an important meaning, is that, is knowing that it was Māori who were called New Zealanders in 1840. There were only 2,000 Europeans here, and they primarily identified as British. So when Te Tiriti talks about New Zealanders or the Māori people of New Zealand, it's talking about Māori, the chiefs, tribes, and the respective people thereof. So
Right.
that's one important contextual thing. And the other is that tino rangatiratanga is a really broad concept, and it's a Māori concept, and it needs to be understood within its cultural meanings. And the guarantee of tino rangatiratanga was to Māori, and that's very broad. It's around lands, villages, and all their treasures, which includes, cultural things such as te reo, for example. And so in the proposed treaty principle, tino rangatiratanga has been translated as chieftainship, which when you take that away from the actual context of Te Tiriti, that is a valid word potentially to use if you're referring to the full, context and meaning of Te Tiriti, but it's been used, transformed and distorted into chieftainship for all New Zealanders over all their land and property. And so it's really distilling it down to individual property rights and giving it to all New Zealanders. And that is really not what tino rangatiratanga is at all. And it's not what was guaranteed in the treaty. It's not individual property rights. It's Māori collective rights, that they would retain those existing rights. So it's a conflation to say that it's property rights, and then it's, I guess, reducing it to the point of meaninglessness to give it to all New Zealanders.
Yeah.
We have our avenues for property rights, and Māori were guaranteed tino rangatiratanga, and those things sit along side by side. And to your point around, the equality, I think the treaty offers a pathway to genuine substantive equality, and that's, we have different roles based on a legal agreement that was made between the Crown and Māori hapu and rangatira, and so that is the foundation, and one party doesn't have the right to change that. So there are different rights, and we have different rights playing out all the time in our different relationships. But if an agreement is made, the meaning can't just be changed. It has to. You have to actually understand what the meaning was, and to hold to that agreement. We do that all the time in our lives.
It's interesting you talk about a legal agreement. We often, and like, we're just a couple of idiots from the bottom of the South Island, right? But I often try and think about the treaty like a contract, like a legal agreement between two parties. And now you've got ACT coming along going, oh, that contract that you guys signed and you agreed to, well, we want to add all these people to the contract and give them exactly what the original signatories were. And I kind of liken it to, if you're in a new subdivision, and you're the first house to buy in a new subdivision, and you sign up to the agreement of the subdivision. And then when all the other plots get sold off, they have the availability to change your agreement for the first time. You're like, no, I've already signed my agreement. Like, I signed it with the people selling it, and we've got an agreement. So I'm not going to now change my agreement to them based on all these other people coming in. And I don't know if that's oversimplifying it to a point of offensiveness, but it's like, it seems to me that it's, especially for a party like ACT, who claim things like property rights, et cetera, that it's a very clear contract of the rights come based on this agreement that was signed between two parties, I've got rights between me and my bank that my neighbour doesn't have and has no rights to, because I've made a contract between me and my bank. It doesn't mean that my neighbour gets exactly what I've got, whilst jumping onto my property and taking some of that, square meterage as well. I mean, am I oversimplifying it, or is that an okay way to look at it?
Yeah, and I think looking at it as an agreement, a legal agreement, is critical, because it is, and it was an agreement between nations. So, and that hasn't changed. I think, I think your point about giving everyone what was guaranteed in the treaty, like, it's not even doing that. It's actually changing what was offered. So, as I've outlined, it's changing tino rangatiratanga to property rights, which is a very narrow distortion of what tino rangatiratanga is. And the Article 3 proposed principle, Article 3 gives extends to Māori the rights of British citizens. And that's been really totally changed and distorted in this principle to say that all New Zealanders have the same rights and duties. And that's really a total reversal of the guarantees of the treaty. And I think we need to be clear too. I'm not sure if you saw the breakfast interview with Minister Seymour last week on our letter and the translation.
I didn't, sorry, no.
Yeah, but that was a really interesting interview, because Mr. Seymour, the interviewer challenged him on how he'd chosen which bits to utilise and in these proposed principles, and missed out so many words and so much meaning. And he said something along the lines of, well, the principles, are selected bits. It's not the full text. And so I think it's important to understand that the principles are actually not preferential extracts. They are the essence of Te Tiriti, the Māori text, and the Treaty of Waitangi, the English text. And it's the essence, the full meaning within context, and the intended and actual meaning distilled down into principles. So the principles are not extracts. And the other thing, which was new information in that interview, and a shift in how he was speaking about it, where he has previously, repeatedly said that these proposed principles are what Te Tiriti actually says, the Māori text. And he shifted in that interview to saying more, I've put forward a proposal of the values I think New Zealanders should live by today, and the bits that are important. So more to saying, this is actually what I want the treaty to mean today, which is sort of not really about what the treaty says. And so that's quite a different conversation to the conversation that has been being led, which is around, this is what the Māori text of Te Tiriti actually says. And with anyone who can read it, saying, no, it's not what it says. And so, yeah, our message as translators is that we need to be very clear about what it actually says. And this bill is premised on being actual principles of what the treaty actually says. And so our message to the Prime Minister is that that these omissions, additions, and distortions take the principles so far away from being anything to do with what Te Tiriti actually said, that it shouldn't be entered into Parliament as a bill. And if it is, it really shouldn't state that this is what the treaty says, because that's extremely problematic to have fiction enshrined as fact in our legislation, and even to be going into debate and select committee, which the government did commit to do in the coalition agreement. But we need to be clear as well that this is a government bill. It's not a private member's bill. So the government, all three parties of the coalition, have to agree to what's included in the bill, as you'll see on ACT's campaign website there. So we also don't want to overly focus on ACT, because it is a government decision ultimately, and the Prime Minister is responsible for that, for what the bill actually looks like, and whether or not it claims to be saying what the treaty says. So we've asked that if it is introduced, that there's a conscience vote is allowed, because this is a really big question for all New Zealanders around the principle of truth in our legislation.
I'll come back to the conscience vote because I was going to ask you about that. What you're basically saying, it sounds to me, is that David Seymour's saying this is how I want the country to be. And to be honest, I couldn't think of anything worse than basing a country on David Seymour's principles and ideas around what it should be. Now, I know you don't need to speak to that because, I'm the guy who can pass opinions, and you guys probably don't want to get involved in that. I do want to ask you a question though. We've had Moana Tūwhare on a couple of times, and you mentioned that the meaning has flipped in this. It seems to me as well, from my very limited understanding, but seeking out expertise like yourself and Moana and other people, and Professor Margaret Mutu, who's been on with us, is that when these things were signed, in the 1800s, and the English, the British, Europeans were in such a minority, it was almost Māori welcoming, like co-governance. It was Māori saying to the British, you can come to the table. It was actually a way that Māori allowed the British to be involved, the English, the settlers to be involved. And as soon as, Pākehā became the majority, and including today, it's like, well, let's reverse all these things because we're in the majority now, and we want it our way. Again, going back to that legal document, if your personal circumstances change, it doesn't mean you get to therefore change what this original agreement was. Are we thinking about this correctly? Are we seeing it correctly that once Europeans sort of became the majority, they're like, well, thanks very much for allowing us to the table, now we'll take over?
You're just, to your point initially about the resemblance of the principles to Act's preferences. So, we're limiting what we're speaking about, as you say, to our role as translators,
and 100%.
And that role. But we have noted in our letter that, because an important translation ethic is that there's no biases or preferences or personal interpretation entered into the translation. And although you wouldn't jump to that conclusion, obviously, because of all the evidence we've outlined about the various other breaches of the ethical standards of translation, and given that the proposed treaty principles are not derived from Te Tiriti, as it has been stated that they are, and that they actually look like Act Party political preferences and policies, we have noted that it's possible that the ethical standards of objectivity and impartiality have not been adhered to in this translation. In terms of that shift in the dominance, that's not something that we've addressed as translators, but if I could just switch to speaking for myself briefly, I'm a Pākehā New Zealander who's been fortunate enough to learn te reo and, develop a career in this space. And it'd certainly be my observation that, the Māori didn't really need, they were dominant. There was several 100,000 Māori at the signing of Te Tiriti, and so, it really was giving permission for, for the British to create government to manage their own people and processes. And the treaty guarantee was that Māori would retain tino rangatiratanga alongside. So, I think we are in a situation where obviously the power imbalance is very different these days. And so that leads to a very different conversation and situation and decision-making process, I guess. And so, my perspective would be that that's definitely playing out here, because, one party to the treaty changing the meaning and application of it without full agreement and engagement with the other party, that's not what you do in a legal agreement. And the power dynamics make that at least look like a political possibility at the moment, which is very concerning for anyone that's interested in good governance and upholding agreements.
Yeah, and I mean, I know, not to oversimplify it, I don't get to tell the bank that I've decided to change how my mortgage is structured without a conversation with them. It just seems a no-brainer to me. I want to play something for you because you've talked about it being a government bill, and the first time I've thought about that, that's really interesting. We've been saying for a long time, because Mr. Luxon invited some of these parties to the table to form a government, the way we've been wording it is, if anything breaks because you've let them through the door, Mr. Luxon, then you own it. But we've been saying it more in sort of a moral perspective, but you're saying this is literally a government bill because of how it's been set up. This is not just a you're allowing act to come through and do this. It's like you guys have to be in agreement to do this. And so I'm fascinated as to now, because this now that I'm thinking of it that way, this interaction between Hinerangi Forbes and Tama Potaka feels very different when she asks him about the bill, and he basically won't answer it, and he doesn't know who's translated it, and he won't say whether he agrees with your guy's letter or David Seymour. It's only about 90 seconds. I'll just play this for you.
And just to be clear on the just to be clear on, it's actually X campaign website which says that all three parties have to agree on the form of the bill, and the coalition agreement is that it will be progressed along the lines of what ACT campaigned on. But it does, they do need to reach that agreement, and it will be entered into Parliament as a government bill if it's entered, not as a private member's bill.
All right, so let's have a listen to this interaction.
What we've said, that's what we've committed to.
But do you think that the translations are inaccurate as our mātanga reo have stated in the open letter?
I think there are various translations given to
well, there's three.
treaty.
There's three, and they're in the bill, and you would have seen them.
I've not seen the bill being presented yet. No, we know that there's a draft act policy, and I've not seen a bill.
Do you trust the likes of Te Haumihiata, Perepi Walker, Tātere McLeod, Stacey Morrison, as our mātanga reo, who say that they are highly inaccurate and they are worried that this is going to be a bill that is going to Parliament?
I have seen the letter, and I'm very appreciative of the letter, and expressed some very genuine concerns. In addition, the National Party and the ACT Party have an arrangement, the coalition commitment, to take a bill forward.
Yeah, except that you are the Minister of Māori Development. Wouldn't Te Iwi Māori expect you to ensure that our reo is being handled, treated, translated to the utmost quality? I mean, do you even know who translated it?
I'm not aware of who within the ACT Party has been involved in doing this work.
Will you chase that up? Is that important to you?
This is very important to me.
So
it's
will you chase it up?
Important. It's very important to me to ensure that we follow through on our coalition commitments, but we also follow through on some of the concerns, genuine concerns and legitimate concerns that our mātanga reo have raised.
I guess one would say, what if you can't do both? What if you can't address the concerns and support the coalition? What does one do? Now, this brings me to another question about the conscience vote, which I'll do next, but would you like to speak to that? Would love to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing as a government minister talking about this bill from a position of, the one who should be protecting and uplifting and driving Māori policy through.
Yeah, the letter was to him amongst other senior ministers, and he is very expert speaker of Te Reo Māori and in Te Tiriti and treaty, and has a background working for iwi. So he absolutely would know what the treaty says in Te Reo and in English, and I think he should be very concerned about what the proposed principles are, and I hope that he's noted that the letter raises very real and legitimate concerns, and he did say somewhere else that it's a really important letter. So I hope that it's helping to enable him to have the conversations that he should be having with his colleagues to draw attention to these inaccuracies. And although it's easy to focus on ACT around this, actually the focus is perhaps more on national, because they could stand up stronger and say that this is not what Te Tiriti says and this is not what National represents or stands for. And although we've agreed to take it to this point, we strongly disagree with it. And they haven't said that. So, they have said that Christopher Luxon, as stated as leader of the National Party, that National wouldn't support it past select committee. However, he made explicit that he was stating that as the leader of the National Party, not as Prime Minister, which could seem to leave the door a bit ajar for Prime Minister potentially requiring the government to take it further if needed. And we do know from written questions in Parliament that, as government resource in the Ministry of Justice that is developing the bill. And we also know from those written questions that those officials are continuing work on a referendum for the Treaty Principles Bill as part of the bill's development. So, a referendum's right at the end of multiple processes in Parliament. So it's very concerning that that's still being worked on, even though the leader of the National Party has said it won't be progressed further. So that seems to give some mixed messages about the situation, and that's extremely concerning given the inaccuracies in the translation.
And look, respectfully, that you won't speak to this, but the National Party has told such a lot of bullshit between what was pre-election to post-election. How can you believe anything they say? My opinion today that they will or won't do. But that does bring me to this last question about your requested actions, which you've already mentioned today. And you've said allow a conscience vote by all members of Parliament on the treaty principle bills for all readings should it proceed to Parliament. We've been saying for the last 6 months or so that that's possibly the plan by National to get this through as opposed to not, because I've done the numbers and I think, if you assume all of New Zealand First and all of ACT vote for this, then you have to get 43 out of the 49 National MPs to vote for it on a conscious vote, and then it would pass in government. We spoke to Tau Hanari, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, and he made it very clear when he was in the National Party, there was a lot of people then who would have absolutely done what they're looking at doing now. There just wasn't a climate for it. Do you not think that putting it to a conscience vote might actually be the thing that gets it through rather than perhaps the opposite?
Well, the government has agreed to take it through the first reading into select committee. And, we understand from various conversations that have been happening with National Party MPs that a lot of National Party MPs are not supportive of it. And so, if the first reading was a conscience vote, that would give the opportunity for National members to do the right thing and uphold the principle of truth for legislation. And I saw, I think it was yesterday that Hekia Parata had spoken out asking people to boycott, saying she supports a boycott of the Treaty Principles Select Committee. So, it is a complex question.
You're confident that, though, there'd be at least 7 National MPs under a conscience vote that wouldn't vote for it, because that's what would need to happen for it to fail. You're pretty confident that 7 or more would?
It is a complex question, and we're not hearing anything from the government that suggests they would make it a conscience vote. They've agreed to take it through to the first reading. So,
But that's how they get around it. That's how they get around. We only took it to the first reading, and then we made it a conscience vote, and then it has the possibility of getting through. But I look. I mean, gosh, when I looked at those numbers this morning, I thought, you probably have more than 7 MPs that wouldn't want it. You probably have a good chunk. But then that's me again, trusting the system and trusting what has been said. And we've already seen numerous examples of things that have been said last year that either aren't being done this year, or nothing that was talked about last year that is being done. Smoke Free 2025 is a perfectly good example. So I don't know. It makes me very nervous. I'm nervous for the country. I'm nervous for people talking about this as the next 1981 Springbok tour. Should it go forward? Very thankful for what you guys have done. And is there anything else you want to leave us with before we wrap up? Because I'm just going, it's great to have you on. It's very thankful for you giving us some time, especially from your COVID recovery, to explain the letter in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I guess just to reflect that it is incredibly complex, and it's a very complex situation. And yeah, I think, touching on what you just spoke to, I think the last thing we want to see is polarization and huge division. And so hopefully our letter has helped to increase some understanding and bring some awareness to, I guess, to what's foundational to the proposal, and that it is deeply flawed translation. So yeah, we hope that promoting that understanding and sharing our professional expertise with the government will help a small bit in this process.
It's just so bizarre, if you had cancer, you'd go to the most qualified doctor you could to get a diagnosis. If you were building your house, you'd want to have the most qualified builder to make it a good job, and then when it comes to issues around Māoridom, they don't want to go to the experts. I mean, this government has said that they're literally not going to take official advice, that that their ministers will ignore it. And that question about who translated it for ACT, I think, is a massive thing that we need to know. And then they're going like, I'd go to the oncologist if I had cancer, but I'm certainly not going to what I'm calling the professionals who understand the Māori language when we're talking about translating the Māori language. It's just bizarre, Melanie. Thank you so much for joining us today. Melanie Nelson is a Māori, a licensed Māori translator and a spokesperson for the signatories of the letter we've just been referencing. Have a good day, get well, and thank you for your time.
Kia ora. Thank you.